Good afternoon. Good afternoon to everyone who have taken the time to log in to our inaugural session, the Research Lands, a lightning series. So before I start, I think there are a few housekeeping. I think firstly, I need to apologize for those who may have missed this session because I think there was an error in the invite. Uh, the time shown in some of the invite was actually 12:30 a.m., although it was supposed to be 12:30 p.m. So that may have resulted the session not popping up in your calendar if it was set to your calendar. If you have just based on the poster, then I think many of you would be here now. Nonetheless, we have got those who have registered for the event, for the talk today, and we will ensure that the recording of the session today is made available to everybody. So there was some technical error in our side when we put in the Zoom invite. So nonetheless, we will still go ahead with the session today. So the aim of this inaugural session is basically to link up the the excellent work that the faculty and researchers of UB is doing on research related to the nation, research related to the region. So our aim is basically to highlight the kind of work that the researchers have done and how it can be impactful for decision makers, how it can be impactful for the industry, and how it can be impactful even to the society. So we will have series of talks over the next many weeks. Most probably we're going to be having this every alternate Thursday, same time. And if you see the title is Lightning Series, why is it called Lightning Series? Because it's supposed to be very short and brief. So the presenter will actually speak for just 15 minutes and he or she will actually take 15 minutes of quick question and answer. And what we are also doing in this session is we are linking you up. So we will actually provide you the email communication of the researcher. So the researcher you are able to directly communicate with the researcher. If you have uh, projects coming up, you need some assistance or you need some advice, then this is the this is a forum for you to actually start to know or get to know the researcher. So without further ado, let me introduce our first talk today. The title of the talk is Perceptions of Climate Change, Implication for Climate Action. This talk will be presented by Dr. Adelle Thomas, who is the director of the newly set up Climate Change Adaptation and Resilient Research Center at the University of the Bahamas. This is an important topic, uh, especially for us here in the Bahamas. The perception of climate change uh, have changed significantly over the many years that we have heard about this topic. Of course, of late, the focus have been on the global pandemic that we are facing, the health pandemic, but we are not going to be forgetting the whole issue of climate change, especially when we talk about sea level rise that is happening across the globe. So I think this is an important topic for the region and also for the Bahamas. So now I would like to call Adele to you can share your screen, Adele, and you can take the floor for the next 15 minutes.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining. Before I get into the talk, I'd just like to acknowledge the current state of the world, mainly, the ongoing pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. And both of these have really highlighted the inequalities that are present for us on a global scale and within our communities and our social structures. And when we're dealing with these immediate challenges and all of the news that can be, both uplifting and incredibly heartbreaking, sometimes at the same time, I think it's difficult to think about anything else. And I myself had to really focus to put together this presentation and think about how to frame this in our current reality. So, why should we be talking about climate change when there are so many immediate issues that are in front of us now? And what is really helping me to make sense of this is the fact that climate change is what we call a threat multiplier. So people and places that are already vulnerable to the challenges that we face now will be even more affected by the impacts of climate change. And so it is absolutely critical that we still maintain focus on climate change and recognize that it is another form of inequality that we are all going to have to work together to address. So why is research on perceptions of climate change important? And why is it important for national development? It's simply because perceptions have a very strong relationship to climate action. What people think about climate change affects the development of policy agendas. It affects the type of projects that are implemented, and it affects the support that is given to different actions that will address climate change. So basically, if we do not perceive climate change to be a significant threat to our way of life, then the actions that we take will be limited. So today, I'm just going to briefly review the results of a study on perceptions of climate change in the Bahamas, talk about how these perceptions may have been influenced by our experience with Hurricane Dorian, and how this is related to the type of climate action that has been proposed on a national scale. And my argument is that we, as Bahamian residents, have a very limited and narrow perception of climate change risk. And that has led to limited and narrow climate actions that do not actually address the entirety of risks that we face. Ooh. Oops. There we go. So before I get into the results of the study, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So the Bahamas is actually at very high risk to multiple climate hazards. We face more intense extreme events such as hurricanes and droughts. Sea level rise is very significant for us as an archipelago of low-lying small islands. Hotter temperatures, we can expect our percentage of very warm days to increase significantly. More intense rainfall, which is an issue for us as it relates to flooding. Changes to our waters are already happening. Our oceans are becoming warmer and more acidic. And so we have a full range of extreme climate events, which happen suddenly, as well as slow onset events, which take a longer time for those impacts to be felt. And these hazards have impacts on every aspect of life in the Bahamas. So water supply and water security is expected to decrease. Provision of electricity is going to become harder and more expensive. Agriculture productivity and food security is expected to decline. Our tourism industry is also expected to be declining as our environmental conditions change. We can expect an increase in vector-borne diseases and heat-related illnesses. Flooding and loss of land is expected to increase significantly. We are expecting loss of our coral reefs, loss to commercially important fisheries, decline in GDP. You think of it, climate change is going to have some impact on it. So we are extremely at risk to a plethora of different climate change impacts. And because of this, we are consistently assessed as being one of the top most at-risk countries on a global scale. So this is from a World Bank study that looked at sea level rise in particular and how much of our lands would be affected by rising seas. You can see us there on the left, highlighted in the red. Over 60% of our land is at risk. And this is head and shoulders above the rest of the region. Climate change for us is an existential threat. It threatens the very existence of us on a map. And this is part of what I studied in graduate school. So when I came home, I was expecting for there to be much more action on climate change, but it didn't seem as if there was much awareness or recognition of our risks. There were surprisingly high levels of climate skepticism, people thinking that climate change didn't exist or that it was some type of political issue. And so my colleague Lisa Benjamin and I decided to do a survey on perceptions of climate change in order to get a baseline idea of what people thought about the risks that climate change presented for the country. So we did an online survey in 2016. We had a good turnout. The majority of them were Bahamians. This afternoon, I'll just be presenting 5 of the top outputs from that survey. If you would like to see further details, then you can look at the article that we published in the Journal of Environmental Studies and Science. So the first finding is that most respondents were familiar with terms that had to do with climate change. So over 80% were familiar with either global warming, with climate change, or with the term greenhouse gas effect. You that the most people identified as having to do with climate change. The third finding, which was very alarming, was that climate change was seen to be more serious for other people. So we asked people to rate how serious of an impact climate change would be at different spatial scales. And you can see that people that people in other countries of climate change than people in the Bahamas, and then the respondent and their immediate family. And this is actually a common finding in these types of perceptions studies. Climate change is often thought of as a distant risk. So it affects other people in other places a long time away from now. And this is alarming because we are actually one of these countries that are most at risk for climate change. And so it's perturbing that we don't that shoulders above the rest for lands at risk to being lost to sea level rise. So even though we're highly at risk to losing lands, people did not perceive that there was a risk of people needing to move. So with climate change being more of a threat for other people in other places. And that was in 2016. And then we had Dorian. And since Dorian, we have been bombarded with climate change. It's been, there have been multiple events on climate change. It's been a topic of discussion on the radio and in newspapers. Dorian has really been framed as a climate injustice. So we were affected by this monster historical storm that was made worse by climate change. And I think Dorian would definitely have an impact on public perceptions of climate change. However, I think that Dorian would likely result in there being a strengthening of those existing perceptions. So we would likely see more familiarity with those terms. I think more people would be familiar with the term climate change than they were before. The link between climate change and hurricanes has probably been strengthened since Dorian has been framed as a climate change impact. I'm not sure if there would still be that focus on climate change having an impact on the environment and being more significant for other places. We definitely need an updated public perception survey. As I said, that survey was intended to be a baseline and to be repeated to see how perceptions change over time and how to best do public education and outreach. But what I want to talk about now is the national responses to climate change. So what we see the government proposing as actions to deal with climate change, they really reflect this limited and narrow perception of climate change that we saw in that existing 2016 survey. And so I'll just briefly go over two of the main climate actions. The first has been the development of this Ministry of Disaster Preparedness, Management, and Reconstruction. And so within this ministry, climate change is acknowledged as having an impact on the nature and extent of hurricanes. And so we see that while Dorian increased awareness of climate change, this action reflects the perception that hurricanes are a larger threat than the other risks of climate change. So for example, there was no Ministry of Climate Change that was developed to deal with all of the hazards and all of the risks that we face from climate change. And the second main climate action that the government has been putting forward is this focus on renewable energy. So renewable energy in Ragged Island, Grand Bahama, Abaco. The Prime Minister was on 60 Minutes earlier this year talking about renewable energy. And this has very much been framed as our response to climate change. So this is how we're building back better. And so while these are positive steps, they do not address the multitude of risks that climate change presents. So there have been lots of recent scientific reports, and all experts agree that climate change requires transformational change. So our current approaches are grossly inadequate, and they are only focusing on a very small subset of the total risk that we face. And just to illustrate the type of action that we need, this is a map of areas that are projected to be below the annual flood level by 2050. So every year they would experience flooding, and eventually they would be permanently underwater. You can see in red along the coastlines where we have lots of our infrastructure, the eastern parts and southern parts of the island where most of our population lives are all under extreme risk of annual flooding and then eventually being underwater if we do nothing. And then here we see a similar map for Grand Bahama. We can see the majority of the island is at risk. All of those settlements that are out in the eastern end that were decimated by Dorian, projected to be completely flooded and inundated by 2050. And then it's a bit hard to see, but this is what flooding looks like for all of the islands. And this is not even all of the risks. This is just sea level rise alone. So we need much more action than we are currently investing in. Disaster preparedness, putting in solar panels will not address the levels of risk that we face. And so in order to deal with this level of risk, we actually need a much different approach to climate change. We need to include climate change in all decisions that we make moving forward. And this would lead to much different development pathways than we are currently on. This would affect our approach to oil drilling, to how we look at tourism developments, to fisheries. Everything would need to incorporate climate change. And so to support the type of transformational change that is needed, we have the Carr Center at the University of the Bahamas, which is being developed as a critical actor to support climate change adaptation. So the three pillars: research, policy engagement, education, and outreach, all aimed at specifically addressing the actual risks that we face. And so just in closing, climate change is an existential risk for us. It is not some faraway threat. And we have an urgent need to align our perceptions and our actions to the actual risks that we face. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adele, for giving us a very brief but really impactful presentation on the status of climate in the region and how the changes that is happening across the region and across the globe. Let me see now, is there any question? If there's any question, you are free to raise your hand for me to unmute you to ask, or you can put some question in the chat. Adele, so while waiting for this question, looking at how very high risk the Bahamas is with the multiple climate hazard that you've explained, do you think the current legislation in the country to tackle the climate crisis is sufficient? What is your call to the government in I know you mentioned a bit on some of the things that the current government is doing in terms of the new ministry, the focus on renewable energy, but do you think more needs to be done in order for us to be more for us to realize the more how impactful this climate change is going to be to a small nation like the Bahamas?
Yep, absolutely. There needs to be much more that is done. I mean, I've worked, with governments in the Caribbean and also in the Pacific small islands, and we are actually lagging behind other small island developing states in our whole approach to climate change. So, other countries have developed, national adaptation plans, incorporating climate change across all sectors and in all decisions. It's something the countries struggle with, but they've started making steps towards that. And so I think we actively need to urgently start holistically dealing with climate change across everything that we do, and that what we're doing now is not adequate to deal with our levels of risk.
Yeah, there's a question from Dr. Johnson that what other actions need to be taken? I suppose in addition to what we're already doing, what are the actions that needs to be taken?
Yeah, so we need to have a holistic approach to dealing with climate change. So every development decision that we make, we need to look at what are the risks that climate change presents and how are we going to deal with that. So for example, if we think about oil drilling is going to result in more emissions in the air, which is going to place us even more at risk. So we need to have a long think, and I would argue that we do not need to be pursuing oil drilling because it really places us more at risk. We need to conserve our natural protection. So our mangroves, our coral reefs, those provide protection for us against sea level rise, against hurricanes. So that has development implications. Would we be actively pursuing putting in new cruise ship docks and digging up our seabeds to pursue that form of tourism that we know is going to decline as climate impacts increase? So really across the board, through all sectors, climate change needs to be considered, and we need holistic responses to deal with it.
Yeah. Question from Dr. Gangelhoff. With COVID-19, it seems there is an acknowledgement that smaller boutique hotels are more suitable model. How do you see the future of the mega resorts in this context?
Yeah, so from the COVID context, there needs to be the shift away from this mass tourism. From the climate change context, there's also the need for a shift away from this mass tourism. So as we see changes due to climate change on a global scale, it has been projected that you're going to see less international travel, less travel towards the tropics. So we currently, rely on guests from the United States. They are most likely going to be not coming internationally and definitely not coming to places where it's going to be more hot, where you're going to have more hurricanes, all of those issues. And so, climate change is underscoring sort of the changes that we need to make away from this past model of tourism that is not going to be sustainable in the future.
Do you think that the local expert, such as yourself, are sufficiently involved in government policy decision or stands on this issue?
I think that we're starting to be involved. I would definitely say at the beginning stages. I think as we become more vocal, then it brings awareness to the need for government to do things differently, and to draw on resources that are within the country.
Yeah, so indeed, one of the main objective of this session today is also to highlight some of the experts that we already have within the university, and I think we need to be more involved in decision making, evidence-based policy. That has always been my motto, and I think this is one of the opportunity for us to work closely with the decision makers. Um, in addition to coastal plants, should we plant more trees and discourage residents from removing them?
Yeah, so planting trees has to do with mitigation, which is, trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the air. And so we know, that plants play a serious role in helping to reduce emissions. So definitely we need to do that. But I argue that we need to focus much more on adaptation. So what are we
Yeah.
doing to try to decrease our impacts?
Yes. There's one question from One Ultra Foundation. What are some of the quick steps or initiatives you suggest that the foundation can undertake for a sustainable Ultra?
Thanks. So Eleuthera, I think like all other islands, really needs to increase education and awareness about climate change and the impacts that it will have for its residents. So those maps that I showed that have to do with flooding, I don't think that
Yes.
lots of people are aware that, they have direct impacts that will be affecting them. And then partner with the Carr Center at the University of Bahamas, and we can come up with more actions.
Yes. That's always a challenge for us to find the right balance when you talk about economic development and environmental preservation, and tourism being the major uh, earner, the GDP for the country. There's always a question on that. And then we talk about coastal development. So this has been another heated discussion quite often when we see a lot of the coast development that's taking place is encroaching into the sea, including even in New Providence, you see that. So that's always a challenge. So how do we ensure that the current legislation, uh, the weakness in the current legislation that is allowing a lot of the industry to look at some of the loopholes within the legislation, and then they encroach into development areas where they should not be developing.
Yeah, all of that needs to be dealt with. So in other countries, for instance, they have, coastal setback rules where you cannot build in particular areas that are close to the coastline.
Yeah.
So it's putting in that legislation, but then actually enforcing it and being able to turn away development projects that do not want to adhere to that. So even if you have a huge, resort that wants to come in and develop into the water, you're saying no, this place is us more at risk, and we value, our citizens and our longevity in being a country more than short-term development.
What level of resources is needed to respond to the threats? How can we secure these resources?
We need so many resources, which is why we need to look at our communities. We have so many communities that are scattered amongst the islands, and we need to start thinking, can we actually protect all of these communities? So one of the major things I think we need to start looking about is, do we want to relocate? Do we want to consolidate communities to deal
Yes.
with limited resources that we have? There are some global funds that provide resources for climate change adaptation. It is far from adequate. And so we will have to do the best with what we have access to.
What are some ways on a smaller scale can the average Bahamian do to decrease the carbon footprint?
So the carbon footprint, you could do things, like carpooling, not driving as much. Consumption of meat is a huge contributor to emissions. So look at, cutting back on your meat consumption, travel, where you choose to travel and for how long, even recycling initiatives, all of those are things that individuals can do.
Are you involved with the SDG related to climate change? And are you aware of the Bahamas response to the 2030 agenda?
So the Office of Prime Minister has a committee, the SDG Committee, Sustainable Development Goals Committee, which I am a part of, and we have recently developed policy recommendations to address the SDG goals in the COVID response. So yes.
Okay. In addition to the Climate Change Center that you are heading now, do you think that there should be an actual government ministry with responsibility for monitoring the questions of climate change? If so, should you be not be seeking to advocate for such by presentation such as this to the parliament, to the parliamentarians, and through the public media?
I think that definitely climate change should be brought up to the level that we have with disasters. And so if we feel that we need a whole ministry just for disasters, then we definitely need a ministry to deal with climate change.
Yes.
And so I think, yes, education and outreach is part of what we need to be doing at UB, which is what the CAR Center is focused on.
Yes, and then we have one more question. This is, I think, an important question from Dr. Johnson again. What about the role of education? Surely the school curriculum ought to be a vehicle for raising awareness.
Definitely, climate change needs to be into the school curriculum, particularly as it is our young people that are going to be most affected by impacts. But I am always hesitant to say that the onus is on the younger generation. People, my age and above, we all need to do our part into dealing with climate impacts. So definitely education, but action across the board.
Indeed. So thank you, Dr. Adelle Thomas, for an excellent presentation and excellently answered all the questions. It has been a rapid session, I know, a lot of questions. So for those of you who have more questions, please feel free to write directly at research@ub.edu.bs, or you can even write directly to Dr. Adelle Thomas, adele.thomas@ub.edu.bs. This session is recorded. For those of you who missed it due to the confusion with the time, we will ensure that all those who have registered for this session will get access to this presentation. So until we meet again in our next session, thank you, Adelle, for taking your afternoon today to be with us. And thank you for all the participants for taking your time for this very brave 30-minute session that we're going to be organizing quite regularly. So until we see you all in the next session, bye-bye, take care and stay safe. Bye.